everyone. Dear participants, I'm glad to welcome you to the 2020 Global Landscapes Forum on Biodiversity. This is Plenary 2 on harnessing the power of nature and more precisely how financial institutions integrate the local community's perspective. My name is Mariam Pril. I am Head of Cooperation and Sustainable Development at Crédit Agricole du Maroc, and I will have the pleasure to moderate this session. I'm extremely honored to welcome four knowledgeable resource persons. We have Amalia Souza. She is founder and executive director of CASA Socio-Environmental Fund, an organization promoting environmental conservation and sustainability, respect for socio-environmental rights, and social justice. We also have Priya Shyamsunda. She is lead economist at the Nature Conservancy, a global environmental nonprofit aiming to conserve the lands and waters. Third, we have Jennifer Price, President and CEO of Calvert Impact Capital, a nonprofit investment firm that works with investors to move capital into communities that are overlooked by traditional finance. And last but not least, Martin Berg, partner at Pollination Group, a climate change advisory and investment firm, building out investment ideas for environmental asset classes. Our session will run for 45 minutes, and I will be asking 1 or 2 questions to each panelist, and they will have around 4 minutes in total to respond in order to keep time to interact with the audience and take some of the questions that you will send. But before we start, let me quickly set up the stage. Today, we are all aware of the fact that our economies rely on nature. There is widespread scientific consensus on the fact that environmental degradation has already reached levels that endanger the stability of ecosystems, and that these ecosystems underpin the global economy through the provision either of stock of natural capital or flow of ecosystem services. And the COVID crisis that we're living in right now has reinforced this awareness and the urgency for action. It has shown that our economy and our health are strongly intertwined with the ecosystem's health and biodiversity. But as you all know, promoting sustainable patterns of production and consumption requires to scale up the biodiversity finance while increasing its impact on the environment and on local communities. So during this session, we will focus more on how this impact could be maximized in order to pay or remunerate the nature stewardship and encourage environmental action at the local level. Working for Crédit Agricole du Maroc, Morocco's national bank for agriculture financing and smallholder farmers' financial inclusion, I can bring a small testimony on the complexity of the issue. Providing adequate financing to smallholder farmers while expecting a sustainable land use management is quite a challenge. You have to take into account the diversity of agricultural production, as well as site-specific constraints in terms of soil, water, waste management, etc., and bring it together to develop the adequate financing product for the smallholders and local communities. And that brings me to the core issue that comes from it. How can sustainable finance or biodiversity finance bring overall benefits to local communities, and what are the key conditions to ensure these final beneficiaries are positively impacted by the financing? And subsequently, how can we monitor this impact in the most cost-effective and accurate way? As you know, we are progressing a lot on the measurement of the impact on biodiversity and progressing also on the harmonization of these indicators, the indicators that are used to calculate the company's biodiversity footprint. So to which extent do we correctly assess the impact on local communities? And do we have enough common standards and indicators for this purpose? So we will start our panel discussion with Amalia Souza. Maria, or Amalia, sorry, you have dedicated your career to channeling financial resources to the most excluded grassroots groups. In your point of view, how can these philanthropic funds bring benefits to the most vulnerable population groups in rural areas, and in particular for forest communities? And maybe you can help us set up the stage on how the use or the purpose of these funds have evolved over the year. And my second question is about the key conditions that can ensure forest communities are positively impacted by sustainable finance mechanisms.
Flo,
So
thank
the
you.
floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be able to be here with you. Um, well, this is a very big question. And so I just wanted to start with the premise that we need to save life sustaining biomes of this planet, right? That's what this conversation is all about, for people and for all beings. And maybe our human focus is a lot in food production, and because of that, we've created mechanisms that have actually damaged the planet severely. Large production of commodities, for example. And right now, our focus must be on how to preserve and restore the important biomes of this planet. And interestingly enough, if you look mostly in the global south, right, where we still hold the majority of the biodiverse regions of this planet and more intact, they are intact because there are people there. Empty spaces have been destroyed already, and there are people there not only learning and as guardians and stewards of these places, but they are also now defending these places with their own lives. So I think this is an important place to start. Um, so how do you actually support them and to engage, to improve their livelihoods? Because of course they've been excluded from all benefits. They've been in remote regions, and now more than anything, they are threatened. The violence increases in these places because there's a lot of interest. Also, the global south has the history of being providers of raw material, and we are not putting enough value on the importance of these biomes, of how much they can offer to the planet, including in sustaining life. So we, as a fund, as a small grants fund that was started by local actors, we wanted to make sure that we were meeting these communities where they are. You need to start. So in our view, we need to start with small investments as seed funding. All of them, they know what they want. They know what they have around them. They want to keep that way of life, but of course with benefits, right? With health and all that they have the right to as a member of society. So starting where they are with infrastructure, there's a lot of investment to be made to actually even enable them to think and prepare for engaging in maybe value chains of so many products that the forest actually offers us. The thing is, whatever is being extracted from the forest doesn't involve the right math, right? We are not considering that those products have not only the value in themselves, like the Brazil nut or the acai or some of the oils, but they have the value of maintaining our planet's biodiversity. And I think we are starting with in a very unbalanced place because we're not putting the right kind of dollar amount on the real value of that these populations and that these products actually offer us. So we see, there are many possibilities, but mostly we have to remember that these people occupy large territories, that they are collective occupations. They're not even ownership per se. So we need to think about them as groups and collectives that have a purpose together: extractive reserves, the sustainable development reserves, indigenous territories, the quilombola territories, you know, the runaway slaves here in Brazil at least. They are traditional people recognized for the territories. They are resettled communities of family farmers that work together, produce together, and reach the market together. So more than just thinking about production and small holdings, which of course exist in more traditional family farming regions for food production, mostly for urban centers. But if we're looking at protecting entire ecosystems, we are always thinking about collective. So if we think about scaling up, you know, we have this economist language, right? We need to think of how do you scale up good examples of sustainable production. I think the scaling is in the number of communities engaged in the production, because it's not by chance that the places where they live are the most protected, is because they have a lifestyle that allows them to have a real life. You know, we call the buen vivir in the Latin American context, right? A good life where they produce for themselves, and sustain and subsistence living right now is more important than ever. And COVID just threw that in our faces. And then once you have, and then they can engage, and they want to engage in selling some of their products. But the scale is not necessarily one community scaling up the production, is how many communities we are able to engage and to improve the lives of. So I think this is, I'm not sure how long I already took, but I just wanted to leave you with the thought that that really what kept the places functioning, these places that are important for biodiversity, are the communities who live there. So we need to learn and adapt ourselves to make the best investments in them, and by default in our own futures, our own future. So anyway.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your intervention. It provides a very interesting outlook on the impact of biodiversity. So recognition, I keep that word very important word, the recognition of the people, the communities, the recognition of the goods that they produce, and also the recognition of the ecosystem they're living in. And then the need for a collective action and groups and at ecosystem level in order to have the maximum impact, and as you said, to scale up what we're doing and the positive impact of the finance. And I would like to turn now to Priya. She's a renowned lead economist, and I think she can bring her view to that specific point on the additional efforts that could be developed to include more local communities. So she can add up to what you have just said, and maybe also think about the other sectors that encompass biodiversity. We've been talking more about forestry. Maybe other sectors need different actions to be taken. So Priya, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. Maria, I think, took us straight to the ground and gave us a sense of what communities do to live the good life and take care of the ecosystem services that provide them with the good life. And what I am going to do is maybe start a little bit with the big picture. So take, sort of broaden that vision that Maria presented to us, which was right at the ground level, and sort of look at the world a little bit from a distance to understand, again, maybe this word that is much used and possibly abused, but to understand the scale of the challenge that we face. And Miriam, I'm sorry, I'm going to start with forest again, because I was just part of a global assessment on forest trees and poverty that was just launched last week. And so I'd like to draw from this to address sort of this larger question of how do you bring uh, biodiversity and forest related finance to local communities and smallholders. So just to set the stage, there is this, as Maria rightly said, this huge overlap between forest biodiversity and where people live, particularly poor people. So 1/4 of the world's people live within 5 kilometers of a forest. More than 1 billion people derive direct and indirect benefits from forests and trees. 40% of the extreme rural poor, people who live on less than $0.9 per day, around 250 million people, live in forest and savanna areas. So I say this to really just expose the fact that any effort to finance land-based biodiversity conservation inevitably has to be aligned with the needs, the aspirations, and the social norms associated with these local communities. Let's look at the other side of the coin, finance, right? At least in the forestry sector, our data suggests that public international financing for forestry, public aid, which is at about 1.7 billion per year, is either stagnant or declining. In contrast, it is estimated that you need about $70 to $160 billion annually for sustainably managing the world's forests. We had a recent estimate, TNC was part of this, and they put the financing gap for biodiversity overall at $600 to $800 billion per year. So even if these estimates are off, the gap is very clear. So this really suggests that the role of private sector, private financing is not just critical, but it's absolutely essential if we want to do biodiversity conservation, sustainable forestry, and support the poor who live within these lands. Now, private financing becomes operational mainly through market-based mechanisms, impact investments in certification, improved supply chains for commodity markets, ecotourism, PS, what have you, right? A lot of the private financing comes in this way. However, for rural, particularly local communities, smallholder communities, to access and gain from these market-driven activities, we need, at least in my mind, 4 additional areas of investment if they are really to gain. They sort of build on what Maria was already saying, but I'll just categorize these. These are related to, first, improving productivity and skills. If you have new markets, you want to meet communities where they are, but for them to participate in broader market-oriented activities, if that is their desire, that you need skill building and training that is not just technical, but in issues such as financial literacy. Strengthening rights. Maria alluded to this, and there are all kinds of complexities. It's not just individual rights, but it's community rights and whatnot. And because these rights are insecure, you have problems associated with land grabbing, with elite capture, with social unrest and conflict. The new monitoring technologies that are so good for conservation and important for market organization, they can work against smallholders, especially when rights are unclear. Communitarian institutions are particularly vulnerable when they face demand from market commodities. Institutions that were working well can break down. The third point I want to make is that if you really want to address smallholder issues, you have to understand that they live in very remote areas. And so you will need some special infrastructure and institutional investments, particularly to address the remoteness and the lack of connectivity, which is so essential for entrepreneurial activity. Remoteness also means less political power. So they are not able to address the unfavorable regulatory and policy conditions that may affect them. Finally, market access, for smallholders in particularly, access needs to be strengthened. There's a lot of evidence about improving smallholder access to agricultural markets, for instance, much less evidence in the forestry space. But there are 4 challenges here. One is that smallholders are small. That's what they are. So they may need to pool resources. We've got to figure out a way to aggregate resources so they can access the markets. They face variable and possibly very high transaction costs of participation. Certification schemes, for example, transaction costs can preclude smallholder participation, so you need to worry about this. Credit constraints if they want to obtain inputs, particularly in the forestry sector. You would know this very well, Miriam. Market risks. Smallholders are not in a position to bear risks. So sort of smoothing income, all of these considerations are very important if they need to participate in market-oriented activities. So I'll end by noting that there are many challenges, just as you started out saying, Miriam. And I think the way forward, because we are dealing with smallholders, the way forward is to really be thinking about public-private partnerships. Blended financing is likely to be absolutely essential so local communities can gain by improved financing from biodiversity conservation. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too much time.
Thank you, Priya. That's fine. And I would like to jump on the idea that you have mentioned, which is the role of private finance and capital markets, and turn to Jennifer Price from Calvert Impact Capital. I think she can provide some of the answers that you for the question that you were mentioning. So as an impact investor, Jennifer, can you tell us to which extent does your financing approach complement the work that is done on the ground by NGOs or philanthropy organization? How does it respond to the constraints that Priya has just mentioned, and the fact maybe that the farmers or the smallholders cannot bear the risk? So how do you adapt this when you try to reach those communities? And if you can give us some examples, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Miriam, and hello to everyone. As Miriam introduced me, I'm a practitioner. An impact investor is the jargon. As we do our work here at Calvert Impact Capital, what we're trying to do is exactly what Priya outlined, is engage private capital to mainstream conservation finance, and in fact, mainstream a lot of the investments that are just simply overlooked by traditional finance. And what that means just is very much, there's a whole part of our ecosystem that's just not connected to traditional markets. They can't walk into a bank and get a loan. Their business perhaps is perceived to be very risky. So going and finding finance on the capital markets or raising equity is extremely challenging. And so they get left out, they get left behind. And that is the case often what we see with these very local community investments that are really at the heart of preserving a lot of the biodiversity of our planet. And so the question is, how do we engage these communities? How do we engage these projects so that they can access financing and be able to scale and grow the work that is protecting our planet and moving us into a place of sustainability? And so those overlooked markets, they're overlooked for a few reasons we see. One is that the perceived risk is higher than the real risk. So investors perceive them as very risky, perhaps because of the country they're located in, or because the business model they're using has never been tested or proven before. We also see that at times there's a market failure, just there's a misunderstanding or not a lot of data or track record of investing in these assets. So someone just needs to demonstrate that they're investable. And so for all these reasons, that is what we're doing, is we at Calvert Impact Capital, we demonstrate that these investments can be financed. They can return environmental as well as social returns. And then we seek to educate investors, which is very, very important. We're educating them about these types of opportunities. So one, they ask for more, and two, so we can do more of this work. And then finally, we scale. But importantly, how do we integrate the local community perspective is very much through intermediaries. And I want to emphasize this, Miriam, you said show examples. The work we do is very much based on working with intermediaries, working with local impact funds. We do not have people in all the places deep in the communities where the capital is needed. So we work with the local financial institutions, the local impact funds that are based there to really understand what the community need is and ensure that our capital is meeting that need. So we sit between, the capital markets, talking to people at JP Morgan saying, give us your money for this reason, and then the community intermediary that is telling us what the community needs. And so two key things there is one, yes, we want to scale this work. So what I said before, demonstrate, educate, and scale is important. But we also need to remain nimble. In this moment in time, things are very fluid. Crises happen like we're seeing unfold here. It's vital that we don't get too wed to our processes or procedures and that we stay nimble so our capital can be very responsive to what's happening in place. And a quick example of that is we put out a press release with Eco Business Fund Finance in Motion as the fund manager earlier this week, how we bought from their portfolio, which is invested in financial institutions and projects and businesses in Latin America focused on biodiversity efforts. We bought from their portfolio some of their seasoned loans, loan participations. That freed up room for them to do more in community. And so simple things like this, but being able to respond quickly, collaborate, and be nimble are vital in this moment in time.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I would like to build on what you have just said with Martin. Martin, we have recently seen many initiatives, positive initiatives paving the way towards making a specific asset class for biodiversity projects and pollination or the partnership between pollination and HSBC is probably one of these initiatives. I would like to hear you on maybe 2 points. The COVID crisis, we didn't talk a lot about it right now. So how did it make it more justified and urgent to link financial, social, and environmental impacts? And secondly, how you make sure to comply with all these impact requirements in your business model and investment ideas? Of course, if you can illustrate these points, that would be very grateful.
Yes, hello. Thank you very, very much, Mariam. Hello, everybody. As said, my name is Martin Berg. Many of you may still know me from the European Investment Bank, where I spent the nearly last 10 years. So as Mariam said, I recently joined Pollination, and it was actually an advisory and investment firm to help them out building investment ideas. And one of the ideas we now built out recently is really to see how we could get natural capital more to scale. I mean, we heard a lot about that. I think a lot of what was discussed earlier today was really focused on how can we scale up projects, but also we have to also really scale up in the type of finance that is available for natural capital, for nature in general. And that's really what this joint venture is about. Maybe since you asked about COVID, well, firstly, we should probably say we only started discussing this with HSBC just before COVID actually happened in February, and then the whole joint venture was actually negotiated during COVID, which was an interesting experience because we actually never met all of the counterparties there. But I think you raised a good point. I think COVID, highlighted in my mind two things in a way. One is really the need for impact investment on the ground, because we really see that also the impact of COVID is really the hardest on the ground. But also I think there is also a rethink on the investor side. I think COVID has highlighted a little bit the relationship between the economy, between our well-being, and nature. And I think many of, especially even larger investors, really we think, oh, this is not something where we should actually engage much more. And we realize this now also in discussions we're having with investors, that there is actually an interest to discuss this. But you asked a little bit how we want to do this. So I think perhaps I should mention, so the goal of this joint venture we're having with HSBC is really to build a large-scale investment offering for institutional investors. And I think that's unfortunately at the moment really lacking, that large capital has difficulties to actually access nature as an investment in theme in general. So the idea with our vehicle is really offer large-scale investment opportunities. Now, you will obviously say, yes, that may leave out a lot of the smallholders, and I think that's exactly something perhaps that we should also discuss here. I mean, how we can make the link, and I think Jennifer made some very interesting points on how it can still be achieved, and that's really something we're trying to do. So with this vehicle that we're trying to do, we will probably also target a lot of the more developed markets, because we believe there's a lot of nature investment in developed market as well. But for more emerging markets, we have to exactly work through partners and through probably also through intermediaries to really reach the smaller projects and also the smallholders on the ground. I think it's difficult to come in as a last person, because many of the things were already mentioned, what I would have said. But I think one of the other things that we probably should focus on is not only seeing how we can better engage the smallholders, but also how we can engage, how we can build the infrastructure so that actually the smaller projects, which and that's one thing we're seeing. That's one of the challenges we're seeing on landscape projects. That there are multiple revenue streams, but often the projects are quite small and the revenue streams are also small. So I think when we think about scale and aggregation, one of the things we should really discuss and we should really focus on to see how can actually those different the smaller projects, how the revenue streams of those smaller projects can be aggregated so that they become interesting for larger scale investors. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. There are quite a few intermediaries and other organizations are working on that. But I think in order to get really large scale financing flowing that reaches the smallholders, I think that's one of the key components that we should focus on. So I'll leave it here, Mariam.
Thank you very much, Martin. I see that time is running, and we've got quite a lot of questions from our audience. We won't be able to answer all of these, but maybe if you can take just 1 minute, I would like maybe to go back to Amalia on capacity building. We've had a question about capacity building, and I know CASA, Social Environmental Fund, does a lot about this. So if you can tell us just one word about this, and then maybe Priya, we have a question on the how we can how those, okay, let me read it. What initiatives can those of us who are not in the private sector take to motivate private sector investment in nature conservation? So I think that's a very interesting question, because it turns to what we're saying. How can we make investment in nature conservation something attractive? And so Amalia, if you can react to this, and and for Jennifer, maybe 1 minute about the use of digitalization and new technology. As you have said, investors have maybe a high perceived risk, and maybe the use of track record, thanks to the technology, can reduce this. If you can have any specific example to provide on this. And finally, Martin, and that will be also your concluding remarks. Martin, maybe about carbon markets. I know that you've been working a lot on carbon markets. How do the benefits that you can have from carbon markets redistributed and benefit also to the communities, to the local communities? And please, 1 minute for each. Amalia, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I think it was a very interesting discussion because it's very complementary. So where we are as a fund, we are a fund that's been funding South America for the last 15 years. And the reason is because biomes here are cross-border ones. We've already given almost 2,500 grants in 10 countries. So I think this is what we're talking about, scale of small, very coordinated funding to begin, for the communities to begin to get a handle of how you think a project, how do you prepare a budget, and that's where the capacity building aspect comes in. Not only from us, that's waiting for somebody to ask for money, we're actually working within the networks of their partners and strengthening these networks with the grants that are complementary to a bigger vision of protection of territories. So, capacity, so building the capacity gives them a very, we have seen over the years how fast the community that never even knew that there was any funding for whatever they wanted to do, suddenly get seen. The visibility is a very big one. They get stronger. They have their voices louder, and then from then on, it's so fast how they can tap into new possibilities, new partnerships, new resources even. So it definitely, you need to meet them where they are, but they get from there to the next stage very fast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm not completely sure I understand that question, but let me just pick up on a couple of comments that I've heard, which may partially address that, both from Maria just now and Martin. I think and Jennifer. So what's really clear in this conversation is the importance of these intermediaries, because there's a lot of global financing that's sloshing around, but doesn't know where to go. And the promise of sort of these major emerging markets related to natural resources has simply not taken off. But there is this space, perhaps, for innovation with the creation of institutions and maybe platforms using technologies that will allow these kinds of intermediaries to develop, which can make this marriage happen between smallholders who need to be brought up, just like Maria's, exposed, or things clarified so that they know what is available to them, and the financial institutions that are looking for opportunities but can't get to these opportunities directly because it's too far away. So I think an area for some real enterprising activity and innovation may be in the creation of all forms of intermediaries, including organizations like Maria's, but a variety of different types of intermediaries. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Priya. Jennifer?
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now. Is that right? Can you hear me, Miriam? Yes. Okay, yes. So picking up on the last word of Priya, intermediaries, and I think the question was around technology. And then intermediaries are critical. I think two places where I see technology right now being very helpful is bringing smaller investments, like Martin said, into intermediaries. So how do you connect smaller, discrete investments and get them to an intermediary? So finding efficiency there. And then on the other end, around impact and monitoring. So how do we ensure that the investments that are happening, the work that's being done is with the impact intention or the integrity that we are hoping or told? And so in those both ends, technology is playing a critical role. That saying, the one thing I find that technology can't solve is time. These investments are made and then time passes, and you need time to pass to understand how this investment will season, what the outcome of that investment will be, what the returns, impact, and financial will be. And shortening time, I have not found technology to help. And so there just is that element. And with that, I would just say one last word is, we all know that we're hitting a brick wall with urgency. And so patience and time kind of is a contradictory statement with where we are in the world. And so one thing I would just encourage us all to think is not let people get off the hook of doing 5 or 10% of their work with this intent of being both, integrity to financial return in my case and biodiversity goals, but all of change the system. We're always going to be plugging a hole. So all our work needs to have this focus. And I just call that out to those that are in the audience to really consider and act towards.
Thank you, Jennifer. Martin, please, 1 minute.
Perfect. Let me pick up on, before I go to the carbon credits, let me pick up on what attracts private sector investors in smaller conservation projects. And I think it's not that they don't know what they're doing. I think it is more they actually have certain expectations. And I think on the one hand side, there's clearly an expectation for an impact and a measurable impact on the ground. That's clearly one. But the other one is really also to make a return. No investor would provide money without making a return. And I think one of the key challenges with especially the smaller projects is that often the revenue streams are not clear. And I think we have to do more work to clearly spell out what type of revenue streams are available and when can they be achieved, and perhaps how can also be some risks that are related to those revenue streams can be mitigated. And I think this is where public finance can really play a role. What I think, and this links nicely to carbon credits, because I think the opportunity on carbon credits is really that they provide an additional revenue stream, and that cuts both ways, not only for the investor, but also for, let's say, for the smallholder, for the project owners on the ground. It is an additional revenue stream. And if we manage to establish carbon credits even more than they already have been, then I think it offers this opportunity to actually provide an additional revenue stream, which is really helpful to make projects more interesting and also have more revenues that can then be shared.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Martin. I think it's time to conclude. I would like to, it's difficult to maybe sum up all the ideas and inputs that you have shared. I would like maybe to wrap up on the important idea of the need for a finance value chain approach where the funding can flow transparently through all the stakeholders of the value chain, and each one of them may be bringing additional value to the final beneficiary. May it be technical assistance, capacity building, maybe some technology, use of new technology, and of course, the adequate financial products. In order to make this finance value chain efficient and cost effective, and maybe this is also the way to make it more attractive for the investors. And I would like, before to finish, to say that I'm witnessing from where I stand in Africa, in an agri-bank, that we have more and more intermediaries that are being created. We can see in all countries in Africa that new agri-banks are being created with the purpose of stimulating the flow of finance from the north to the global south. And this is, I think, a very interesting perspective for the years to come. So with this, our session comes to its end. I hope the participants have enjoyed it. And I would like also to thank all the panelists, of course, for their insightful thoughts, and thank the organization and technical team. Thank you all for your participation.
Good to meet you all.
Good evening. It's an honor to be asked to speak at this Global Landscape Forum Community One World, One Health conference, as the GLF community comes together to think about how to improve the relationship we have with our landscapes and environment. As the current pandemic has taught us, we truly are one world in which the health and well-being of all of us is tightly intertwined. The last century has brought significant changes to how we eat and also what we eat. The good news is that today's food systems can support the nutritional needs of billions globally. Millions have been brought back from the edge of starvation and have also been lifted out of poverty. Intensive production and sophisticated logistics enable foods that are grown halfway across the planet to arrive affordably to our market shelves. Modern science and technology has helped us to produce more food and move it around efficiently. Nevertheless, many of last century's most pressing challenges in our food systems still persist, and several new challenges are becoming ever more prominent and increasingly urgent. Globally, almost 700 million people go to bed hungry every night, and more than 2 billion are malnourished, which has devastating long-term effects. At the same time, more than 650 million people are obese, and almost 75% of the world's land surface has been substantially degraded, including by intensive agriculture. With a population that will approach 9 billion by 2050, and with more climate stress and higher climate variability on the horizon, the goal of building a more resilient and sustainable food system is more important today than ever before. The good news is that nature has provided us with a key tool to tackle many of our current challenges, the rich biological systems on which we all depend. The diversity inherent in our wildlife, forests, and oceans is critical to the resilience of our ecosystems. And today, I want to talk briefly about a specific aspect of that diversity, the diversity that underpins the future of our food system that has been created by nature, as well as by people and the agricultural systems that they've created over thousands of years. Among the results are almost 5,000 types of potato, over 1,000 varieties of banana, and hundreds of thousands of varieties of rice. Over the millennia, the interactions of people with the plants that are most important to them has given us an astounding range of options to adapt our crops to changes in climate, while also addressing the urgent need to provide enough healthy food for everyone. Each of those myriad varieties of food plants holds precious genetic traits that make them unique. Their root systems may enable them to withstand flooding or garner more nutrients. They may have the ability to resist pests, resist droughts, or flourish despite water scarcity, and some may have higher nutritional content. We need to safeguard this diversity if we're to build food systems that can nourish us all sustainably, nutritiously, and forever. Diversity, after all, is life's hedge against extinction. It's the vital resource for allowing us to meet the challenges that our food systems face, both now and in the future. Preserving and enabling the use of the diversity of the world's most important crop species is the mission behind the Crop Trust, an organisation that was born with the ambitious target to safeguard all of crop diversity forever. This is an essential task for the future of our food, and fortunately, it's a task that's feasible both scientifically and economically. However, as an international community, we're falling short. In Target 2.5 of the Sustainable Development Goals, the global community pledged to safeguard all of crop and livestock diversity by the end of 2020, 2 months from now. And despite much progress in collecting and characterizing crop diversity, and also many successes in ensuring that farmers benefit from crop diversity through breeding programs, it's unfortunately the case that the job is far from done. This issue is at the core of today's conversations, acknowledging that the targets we set a few years ago have not been accomplished, and that if we are to eradicate poverty and hunger by 2030, they need immediate reassessment, along with a new joint strategy to increase our efforts to ensure that our goals are achieved. Next year, we will have 2 critical opportunities to address these challenges: the Biodiversity COP in May and the Food Systems Summit later in the year. At these 2 global gatherings, we will need to commit to working even harder and under even more challenging conditions to achieve the future of food we all want and that the future generations deserve. This conference gathers some of the world's foremost experts in biodiversity and food systems to think creatively and reimagine our future together, including learning good lessons from the past, such as the value of indigenous plants and cultures, the advantages of local food systems, the benefits that flow from understanding local landscapes and environments, and the importance of a diverse, seasonal, and healthy diet. Diversity is the key, and we need to act now so that we can save it and use it, and that will require the commitment of us all. I invite you today to rediscover the power and potential of agrobiodiversity and its importance for the future of all of us. Thank you, and be well.
Greetings to all participants. I'm delighted to share a message with this important forum on a fundamentally important issue for us all and for all future generations. The topic of today's session is harnessing the power of nature to enhance diversity across food systems. So, why is this important? Well, let's be honest. Our global food system is broken. 690 million people go hungry, even before COVID-19. More than 2 billion people don't get enough nutritious food. On top of that, our food production is challenging planetary boundaries. We are depleting the world's water resources, and agriculture contributes roughly to 30% of harmful greenhouse emissions. The world's biological diversity, which, no matter how you look at it, is an important part of the solution, is under siege like never before. According to the latest estimates, 1 million plant and animal species are facing extinction. We are losing biodiversity and reducing options for the future every day, as we speak, in fact. This is crazy, and it's not impossible nor expensive to do something about it. The power of biodiversity is simply not understood, and particularly not when it comes to agrobiodiversity. The good news is that understanding is increasing and the focus is greater than it used to be. I am actually pleased that IFAD is under pressure from member states to do more on biodiversity, particularly its use. Biodiversity has huge potential to help us answer questions we need for sustainable food systems. How to increase yields per acre, how to produce food with high nutritional value, how to have more diversity in our diets, and how to adopt more sustainable production using less water, less fertilizer, and less pesticides. This is why it is so urgent to safeguard and better use biodiversity in gene banks and in the field. And we know we can. Beans with higher iron content, sweet potatoes with higher vitamin A content, more drought-resistant wheat and rice have all been developed, just to mention a few. And we can develop these plants with natural breeding provided we have access to the greatest possible amount of diversity and that we put science as well as farmers to work. In so many ways, farmers can champion new and better use of biodiversity. Agriculture is a lifeline for 2.5 billion people who live on 500 million small-scale producing farms, 63% of whom live in poverty. These smallholders, many of whom are indigenous peoples, are custodians of biodiversity and ecosystems. Small-scale farmers, through their work and cultures, are intimately connected to the natural environment and how it is used. This is why their involvement is central to identifying solutions to biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, and climate change, both at local and global levels. But they also need new tools, additional knowledge, and not the least finance to contribute to the new resilient food system that the world desperately needs, and to do it in a way that supports their livelihoods. With IFAD's mandate to improve the livelihoods and well-being of rural smallholders, we are uniquely positioned to promote innovative approaches in our projects for sustainable production and food systems across rural landscapes. But we can't do it alone. We need partners. The Food Systems Summit that the UN Secretary General has taken the initiative to host next September is a great opportunity to build the partnerships that are required to put our food systems on a resilient footing. IFAD is delighted to be the UN anchor agency for the summit's action track on equitable livelihoods. We will use our position in the summit to ensure the livelihoods of rural small-scale farmers do not become forgotten and come as an afterthought when we talk about transforming food systems. Without transforming their livelihoods, our food systems will continue to stay broken, and we will not be able to protect nor harness the biodiversity in the vulnerable landscapes they inhabit. Biodiversity is also important for all other action tracks. I indeed hope and invite all good partners to come together to make sure we make good use of the opportunity of the Food Systems Summit to raise awareness about the fundamental importance of biodiversity, particularly agrobiodiversity, and that we get it sufficiently high on the agenda for concrete decisions to be made for actions to safeguard and use biodiversity as an important means for future resilient food systems. The need to do so has never been clearer. So, to conclude, action is urgently needed, and none of us can do it alone. This is an invitation to work together. I hope we are all up to the task. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation, and I wish you an engaging session.
Haga and Sir Peter Crane for not only setting the stage for this panel, but reminding all of us that safeguarding biodiversity is both dependent on farmers and all of us as eaters, and that we need new strategies and new investment while also learning from the past. We have a fantastic group of speakers, and I won't take time to introduce them all, but Kent, Susan, Mildred, and Pablo are all here to share their thoughts with us on how we can move forward, how we can really pave the way forward for Sustainable Development Goal 2.5 post 2020. So I just want to dive right in. We have a short amount of time to talk to all of you. SDG 2.5 is a huge goal, and unfortunately it hasn't fully been achieved. So my first question to all of you, and maybe take 30 seconds for you each to answer, is how far along are we and where do we need to go? Again, be succinct, tell us where you think we're at in achieving this goal and what needs to be done over the next year, 5 years, 10 years to really get to the achievement of it. Susan, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yes, I think for me, the most important thing is to see the SDGs as interconnected. And particularly, you can even just look at SDG and look at its targets. So SDG 2.5, which we're talking about, is really about genetic diversity. And we look at that as a source of traits. It's very important. But international law defines agricultural biological diversity much more broadly. It defines it at the species and the ecosystem, so it's not just the genetic level. And I think it's really important that we make that connection. And in that way, we also connect sort of ex situ collections with what's happening in farmers' fields and see these as things, both things that need to be supported as complementary strategies. And the evolution of these resources in the field is really important.
Yeah, I want to come back to that issue of interconnectedness with you in a few minutes. Pablo, why don't you go next? Pablo, I believe you're on mute. We can't hear you. I'm just going to, you got it?
Yes, biodiversity is a key in many crops, and I'm most familiar with coffee and cocoa, for instance, and in both of them, biodiversity plays a huge role. It also plays a social role because, some of the most traditional cropping or cultural practices for growing these items have to do with growing different products in a biodiverse environment. And
absolutely,
what we're seeing right now is that the world is paying attention to it. For instance, there's a coffee certification for bird-friendly grown
absolutely
coffee by the Smithsonian institution. So we're starting to recognize that some of these traditional practices protect the biodiversity of our crops.
Right. That awareness is definitely growing. Kent, why don't you go next?
Thank you very much, Dana. 2020 was supposed to be the super year for biodiversity.
Right.
Unfortunately, yes, but the COVID came, it disrupted things, but also highlights the issues we're talking about, that we ignore the warning signals at our own peril, and also emphasizes the fact that global issues, global problems relating to biodiversity need to be dealt with, by international cooperation, by multilateral approaches, which is so critical. And the other aspect, of course, the original global framework for biodiversity, which was the Aichi targets, and which was borrowed by the SDG 2.5, focused only on conservation. But agrobiodiversity, by definition, implies use of biodiversity.
Sure.
That use aspect was not captured in that, and I think that's something that needs to be looked at going forward.
Absolutely. And let's talk about that in a minute, conservation versus use or utilization. Mildred, I'm so glad you were able to join us, come back and join us. So what are your thoughts on how far we are on SDG 2.5 and where do we need to go? And again, just take a 30 seconds or so to sort of give us your perspective. Mildred, I think you're on mute, or maybe you're stuck. That's okay. We'll move on. So Susan, we talked about interconnectedness before, right? And this is one thing that's always puzzled me about the SDGs is there's a lot of them. A lot of regular people don't understand them, and they don't understand how they're connected. How can we do better over the next, in the lead up to the Food System Summit to explain that interconnectedness?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge because it's always easier, I think, for the human brain to disaggregate and to solve for problems separately. But if we don't look at the unintended consequences and we solve for a problem that is actually a complex problem, we get fertilizer because the soil is depleted as opposed to what got it depleted in the first place. So I do think there's an educational component, but I also think there's an issue with power relations and who's being served by. For me, I'm a lawyer, served by particular public policy. And that we really have to look at that. And I would say we really have to look at that in terms of even how this food summit is being organized when we have a committee on world food security.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm quite...
Can you dig a little bit deeper into that? Because I know there's been some controversy. A lot of folks are concerned.
Yeah, well, I very much welcome that we're talking about food systems because I think we have to talk about the system because, again, all these things are interconnected. But it's not just that we talk about food systems, it's about with whom are we talking and how are we talking? That is as important that we're talking about as a system if we're not having the right actors at the table. And right now, the organization of the Food Summit has been pretty opaque. We have an established structure, the Committee on World Food Security, which has been reformed and is more democratic. And there have been, I think 400 or so civil society organizations that have sent a letter asking to get more transparency.
Absolutely.
I think we really have to ask those questions because that's where we get into the power issues. Are we going to ignore things that we know work? Are the people at the table that know, have good ideas about how we need to produce? Are they going to be there?
Absolutely. And I wish I hope Mildred can come back and join us because I know her focus is really on youth and their voices are so needed at the summit. So I hope we can get into that later. Pablo, you've talked a lot about how coffee production in general has a huge impact on smallholder farmers. And you've said that when the coffee industry is doing well, a lot of people are doing well. And when coffee is grown sustainably, there's a huge multiplier effect. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that in terms of how we, again, going back to this idea of paving the way forward for SDG 2.5, how does that relate? What is that multiplier effect? How does that enhance the sustainable development goal?
Thank you, Danielle. And I also want to refer to the previous question because I believe that we can get some market mechanisms to work for some of these crops, like coffee, for instance. Now, I was talking about one particular certification, but there's, organic coffee certification, carbon neutral certification. Carbon neutral is very nice because when you measure your carbon footprint and you start to minimize that carbon footprint, you have to do a lot of other things. You have to protect the species. You have to reduce all the fertilizer and all the chemicals that will go into the soil. You have also like the Rainforest Alliance certification, so fair trade certification. All of these certifications are ways to get closer to the end consumer because if we drink coffee every day and we know where that coffee comes from and how it was produced, and we become more responsible, all the value chain will benefit. And when I say all the value chain, it starts with the small farmers, because coffee is dominated worldwide. You know, it's worldwide grown in developing countries, and it's dominated by small and medium-sized farmers. You know, and many of them are households led by women, more than 30% of them, for instance. So it's that's the multiplier effect I was talking about, because if we do something, in this case for coffee, we're doing something that could benefit a lot of rural communities in developing countries, many of them led by women or by small growers associations. And and another, I want to mention another of those market mechanisms that could help, which is a lot of these coffee regions are beautiful regions, are regions where you go just to see the sights and talk to the people and live the culture. But it also happens that many of these communities are nearby tourism hotspots, you know. And I always use the example of we buy coffee in Peru from farmers that are 10 kilometers away from Machu Picchu. And we have over 1 million tourists going to Machu Picchu every year. Well, except this one because of the pandemic, but over a million, 1.2 million tourists going to Machu Picchu. And none of them know that 10 kilometers away, people grow coffee. And these are beautiful lands. And when you get that chance to get involved with the people and with the, and you know, we see it here in Costa Rica. I'm in Costa Rica, and tourists come here and they don't know where coffee comes from. And
it's a missed opportunity.
It's an opportunity. So these are market mechanisms that makes us all more responsible, so that when we drink coffee every day, we think of how to be more responsible.
Kent, you know, Pablo's been talking a lot about farmers, especially women farmers. And when we're talking about conserving biodiversity, we often forget that farmers have to do that, and they also have to make money. And so I'm hoping you can sort of reconcile this idea of conservation versus utilization. How can we do both effectively?
Yeah, indeed, as I mentioned before, I mean, agrobiodiversity by definition implies use of biodiversity, whether for food, feed, fiber, or for industrial purposes. So effectively, you know, to be able to use biodiversity for agriculture, I mean, to conserve it, but you still need to use it. And secondly, agriculture, as you well know, is the largest user of biodiversity by sector. And at the same time, it has the largest and the greatest impact on biodiversity at the same time. So previous, you know, initiatives have not taken into account that use aspect of biodiversity. And if you look at the previous global framework, which was the Aichi targets, there was a focus on conservation, which was, as I said, transferred into the SDGs. So the essence that not taking into account the fact that biodiversity is the basis of our food security. And that food security is based on use of biodiversity. It was not an objective that was recognized in the previous framework. And then that needs to be taken into account going forward. And conservation is not conservation for the sake of conservation itself. We can only conserve through use, yes, and use, you know, and conserve for use as well. Once we're in the, I mean, considering that we're in the agriculture sector, and farmers are the best practitioners of that, you know, ethos of conserving through use, because by the fact that they use it, it gives it value. They recognize the use, that it's valuable for them, and they conserve it for that purpose. And then, you know, the fact that they're also able to, you know, that use, of course, you know, multiplies into using as a basis for developing further varieties and species that address other needs, including climate and environmental changes that we're experiencing currently.
Absolutely. So Susan, you know, as a lawyer, as somebody who's looking at, you know, the structures and mechanisms that will protect farmers and protect biodiversity, what's needed? I mean, we have an international framework that is supposed to protect farmers, but is it doing that?
No, and I would want to move away from the idea of protecting farmers. Farmers are agents of change. They're innovative populations of themselves. And I also think we have to be really clear that when we're talking about food, we're talking about, it becomes complicated because it's both considered a commodity and it's a human right. So when we talk about coffee, we're having a different conversation, though there's things that are relevant than when we're talking about food. Though I still think, there are lots of rules that can be used that like bird friendly, but I think that we have to make distinctions when we're talking about coffee or horticulture versus, crops that people eat. And I think our problem is again, that there's been a lot of focus, I think, on market-based approaches. And again, there can be a role for the market, but markets are regulated. And right now, public policy and market incentives in general have encouraged the production of uniform commodity crops. And that has displaced small scale farmers on farm. It is eroding agricultural biological diversity. So I think we have to have very tough conversations about what do we think markets can do? How should they be regulated? What markets shouldn't be allocating? What should our governments be doing? And again, democratically accountable spaces. So those are, it's not enough just to be pulling in with your Prius into a farmer's market and think we're good, right? We're in a globalized system, and that has an impact on what smallholder farmers can plant and how they plant it. And well, sorry,
please finish. No, go ahead.
I think we have to ask our questions about what do we subsidize, what do we not subsidize, where do R&D dollars go? We know there's more and more evidence about the value of agroecological approaches, and that's the word that's used in the Committee on Food Security, regenerative. There are lots of, but that's been around since the 1920s, growing evidence about that. But if you look at R&D dollars towards that, very low percentage.
Absolutely. And if you want to go back, I mean, regenerative farming has, sure, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was going to talk about the issue of, Susan raised a very good point about markets, the role of markets. There's certainly a huge market failure when it comes to conserving diversity in agriculture. It is not the appropriate instrument or mechanism for the purpose of conserving biodiversity. Diversity in agriculture and agrobiodiversity is a global public good that needs different mechanism and an approach to do so. So it's not the markets that can control that, essentially, because of the incentive measures, the subsidies that are involved, as well as the general dynamics of the global, trade processes that encourage different processes that do not encourage, protection and conservation of diversity.
Yeah, and I think Pablo, any thoughts? Please add, Pablo.
Yes, I'd like to add, a different perspective to this, because I know there's a role in government and there's a role in the markets. And I think we can do both. We can do more of both, because we can try to, for instance, the carbon markets have that type of mix. You have to regulate, and then you place emissions quota, the governments place emissions quotas, but then you create this market for carbon bonds, and then there's some market mechanisms around it. So we have to work around those types of incentives. And I know coffee is different from other crops, but I'll go back to coffee, and I always recommend, to the small growers, get away from the commodities side of the business, do something different, something special, something that can show to people, and let's try to, again, I'm biased because I'm in Costa Rica, so we have tourists all over the place. But when those tourists go to those small farms and see these farmers working and all the work that goes into coffee and all the things they do to protect the environment, and they see the birds and they see the mammals, and they see the forest, the shade, shade-grown coffee is another certification. Okay, they see all of this and they get in love with the situation, and they're willing to pay for it, because that's the market mechanism that I'm referring to. So I think we need a little bit of both, or a lot of both.
Sure. Mildred, it's so nice to see you back. I hope you can hear me. I want you, we were talking about people who are missing in this conversation. often, and one group is youth. And I'm hoping you can talk about your work with youth in Jamaica and how, they're not only protecting biodiversity, and making it available to schools and their communities, but how they're often left out of these conversations, global conversations around the future of agrobiodiversity and what should be done. So because we haven't, had a chance to hear from you, please take a few minutes to talk about your work and how we can encourage that more youth are heard.
Thank you very much. I believe that we have to think seriously about succession planning. And of course, our youth plays a critical role in that area, because when we think about retiring, then that baton has to be passed on. And we have to make sure that we pass on the information that the history or the legacy continues. Of course, I think that emphasis needs to be placed on digital technology in agriculture, especially for developing countries like the Caribbean, as a key transformation vehicle to enhance trade, food production, and processing, and to build robust and resilient food systems. Digital technology methods can close many gaps as it manifests itself in the lives of small farmers. And we have to look at schools in the category of small farmers. They have these tutorial farms, but they make a big difference in the lives of communities and even larger areas that you would call districts. It also lends an understanding or an ear to the situation that exists in most of these underdeveloped or developing countries, where only 2% of the budget or the national budget goes to agriculture. And so agriculture carries a burden of discrimination in these areas. Absolutely. Where they are always left behind and seen as a sector that it's the less fortunate who do this work. However, when it comes to feeding household, agriculture is seen as the rescue agent. Based on all of this, I believe that, and it has been proven, that we have to ensure that the culture of biodiversity is cemented in the minds and is practiced from the start, and that is in the schools, so that when these people come and take up their careers, or they are agro entrepreneurs, they will be ready. They will be well carved to fit into where we have left off, and to even build better using the digital technology.
So well said. Please go ahead, Ken.
Sorry, if I jump in there, just 2 seconds.
Please.
Yeah, I think there's also a moral argument to be made in this sense, because at the end of the day, it's the youth and the future generation that will have to suffer the consequences of our profligacy and our failures and omissions. In that sense, they ought to be part of the conversation now. Need to be included in the processes, and should be taken into account.
And
may I add that?
Please. Please go ahead.
May I add that this cohort of people, young people, are very innovative, and they can do a lot to make a lot of changes in even some of the policies that our governments make. So I think this target group this cohort of people needs to be trained and trained, and we need to accept them, give them that kind of acceptance that they feel wanted in this area, and when they feel loved, they will stay.
I love that. I love that. And I love that you said the culture of biodiversity. I think having the culture put back in agriculture. Pablo, please go.
No, I'd like to just reinforce what Mildred and Kent are talking about, because it's the most beautiful schools that I've seen are in very remote rural areas. You know, schools where you see the uh, environmental practices in place. You know, doing all the recycling, having their vegetables produced there, having, you know, in the schools by the children, and and from my experience in Latin America, that is a lot easier to do in rural areas,
Mm.
and we have to do that. But where the real challenge is in the cities. You know, our cities are not as environmental as they should be. So I
Sure.
think when we think of public policy, okay, that's great because we adults who maybe did not have that type of education when we were kids, the younger generations actually require that from us, you know, and it's happened in my case, in my personal case with my children. You know, they they went to school, they received their environmental education, and then they came home and required us to implement those practices at home. So that's
Sure.
good, you know.
I
But I
Sure.
see
Susan,
a
please.
bigger challenge in cities than in rural areas.
Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think just reinforcing that, I think the important thing is that rural life has to be attractive. It can't be something to do this, I'm going to be poor and hungry. It has to be attractive. And there may be some market solutions to make it attractive, but there also needs to be public policy to make it attractive. That, you know, if we think agrobiodiversity and the innovative activities of smallholder farmers are producing something that's important to us to achieve the Agenda 2030, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, then we need to provide public support for that. We need it to be attractive. And in that way, it would help us with, you know, this urbanization and the poverty in cities. And we can't ask people to do something that's not attractive, and it certainly is not going to be attractive to youth, you know, if it means I'm going to be poor and hungry.
Really, rural areas need to be stimulating, really interesting, fun places to live where people want to be there and not feel forced to be there. Before we turn to questions from the audience, one thing that I've been worried about, I mean, obviously COVID-19 presents so many challenges, but one thing that I've heard from talking to chefs and scientists is that because, you know, the closure of so many restaurants and schools and other institutions around the world, that the demand for biodiverse products from farmers is diminishing. And, you know, farmers who were growing for whether it was high-end restaurants or other, you know, institutions, they're you know, they're losing a big market. Are you worried that COVID-19 is going to have a big impact on what farmers are growing in terms of biodiversity? If you could each just take a few seconds to answer so that I can get to at least one question from the audience. We're running over.
I would say that that's a pretty narrow question, because again, you're looking at the connection between a chef and a farming community.
Well,
and that,
but it's institutions who procured from farmers, whether it's schools or hospitals or others.
I agree. I mean, but I always worry a little bit when we try to put the solution all on a consumer. When I think it's the consumer's choice is, you know, policies are influencing what choice exists. And COVID-19, I think, has definitely exposed vulnerabilities. And where there was this kind of relationship and procurement, I think, you know, that's something we have to look at. But what we've seen is there's more resilience in these shorter chains where there's, you know, where there's your reliance on the local food system and those connections, that's where the resilience is. And the longer the chain, the more vulnerable one becomes. And so, yeah, very important, I think, to be able to have public procurement policies and to have those continue to support smallholder farmers, to support diverse, nutrient-dense foods. And I do think COVID-19 has also just exposed the interconnections. I mean, the fact that we have people more vulnerable to it is because they have, you know, non-communicable diseases, which are related to what they eat, because we're not producing healthy food. So my hope is COVID-19 is some ways can catalyze us to see the connections between health and nutrition and diversity and climate change, and that pandemics are more likely because of biodiversity loss, because of habitat destruction. These things all go together. And that's how I'm hoping we will learn that we need to be figuring out how to work together to solve the problems.
Absolutely. So I want to get to this question from the audience. Pablo, I'm going to interrupt you. I want to at least one audience question. So the listener asked, most farmers are rural people who depend greatly on using biodiversity. How can we encourage participatory management for agrobiodiversity? Are there experiences that you can each share?
Indeed, yes. In fact, if I can, my intervention was essentially also partially in response to this question. I was following up from what Susan said. Of course, undeniably, the impact of the COVID pandemic was significant and devastating in a lot of cases. But at the same time, there were a few positive there, which includes the fact that for a lot of farmers, especially those who were just getting into the planting season when the pandemic broke out, because they couldn't access immediately the market, they would, which is the easy option, go to the market to get the seeds they need for planting. Now we have to resort to some of the diversity that had conserved for different purposes. And those are usually the local, well-adapted varieties that they've used. And they resort to it, or also going to their neighboring farmers to get the seeds for cultivation and then using those local varieties. To that extent, it had helped to conserve and continuously use that as well. But also exposes the vulnerability that we have when you have long, supply chains that are there. That's the shorter the chain, the more advantageous it is. And that, goes to support the argument that local seed systems should be, really reinforced and supported. Either by supporting, local seed banks or seed conservation systems, as it were.
Mildred, I'd like to give you the final word about these participants, please.
I want to share a Jamaican experience, and also I want to define the role of farmer in our own context. It is the duty of the farmer or the primary producer to cater for the varied sophisticated diets that really exist all around. And COVID taught us a lot of things. In Jamaica, we didn't have a food shortage. And while the hotels went down, the government of Jamaica pumped some stimulus packages in. So the farmers were cushioned, the cost was cushioned there, and the cost of food became less, and all the persons in small household or who make up small household families were able to buy food at a very low cost.
Sure.
So you find that the distribution of the food went around to the household. We didn't waste anything and we didn't lose anything. So, and we continue to have that kind of system here just now in Jamaica. So we are happy with it, and we are hoping that it will last. And our farmers are not complaining because we still have circulation. Our economic status is still average. Might not be the highest, but we are on average right now.
I really think the world has a lot to learn from what Jamaica is doing. I'm so sorry, we have to end. This has been a really invigorating conversation. There's too much to talk about. You are all amazing. Thank you, Susan, Pablo, Mildred, and Kent. And I look forward to hearing more from you over the next several months as we gear up for the UN Food Systems Summit. And thanks to all of our listeners and viewers.
Thank you, Danny.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
¿Pueden oírme todos? ¿Está bien? ¿Sí? Ok. Hola, buenas noches, buenas tardes, buenos días. Es un gusto para mí estar aquí. Gracias, Global Landscape Forum, por la invitación. Mi nombre es Ana Gómez. Yo soy brasileña, pero vivo en Alemania. Estoy terminando mi maestría en bosques tropicales sostenibles, con enfoque en equidad de género en cadenas de valor de productos forestales no maderables. Yo seré la moderadora de esta plenaria, y solo para recordarles que toda la información de esta plenaria se quedará grabada, y tenemos una persona que nos ayudará captando los mensajes principales de nuestra sesión. Tengo aquí conmigo 3 personas ilustres que han trabajado con soluciones financieras para bioeconomía. María Anela Feole representa el Fondo de Cooperación, una organización de Costa Rica que promueve el desarrollo sostenible mediante el financiamiento y el apoyo técnico a productores rurales de todo el país. Y vamos a conocer más adelante sobre el mecanismo de microfinanzas que la institución creó y está implementando. Marina Campos es apasionada por los bosques y su gente. Ella tiene mucha experiencia con áreas protegidas, comunidades indígenas y instrumentos financieros para la conservación, especialmente en la Amazonía brasileña, y hoy representa la empresa Conexus. Elcio Mancinere, conocido como Toya Mancinere también, es un líder indígena, miembro de la coordinadora de las organizaciones indígenas de la Amazonía brasileña, además de coordinar la unidad de recursos naturales de la Coordinadoría de Organizaciones Indígenas de la Cuenca Amazónica. Entonces, toda la Cuenca Amazónica está junta en esta organización. Entonces, en nombre de GLF, muchas gracias por estar aqui com nós, os 3. Então, agora eu pergunto para a Marina, vamos começar a plenária. Eu te dou a palavra, Marina, para compartilhar com a gente um pouquinho de como que você vê esse panorama geral de soluções financeiras voltadas a fortalecer estratégias de bioeconomia. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Ana. Eu que agradeço. Eu queria começar agradecendo no seu nome o GLS, Biodiversity 2020, pelo convite. E é um prazer para mim, acho que agora a gente não fala mais em dividir o palco, né, mas em dividir a tela com pessoas tão ilustres quanto o Elcio, você, Ana, e a Marianela, né? Acho que vai ser um debate interessante e tenho bastante aqui para aprender com vocês. Então, em termos de uma maneira geral, a gente poderia dizer que quando você olha para o relatório de Finanças da Biodiversidade 2020, de 2018, feito pelas Nações Unidas, eles têm um valor que é bem interessante. Cerca de 52 bilhões de dólares hoje são utilizados para finanças para a biodiversidade globalmente no mundo por ano. Esse número, apesar de parecer um número grande, no próprio relatório a gente pode notar que ele é muito aquém do número necessário, que o número necessário para fazer essa conservação global seria cerca de 3 a 7 vezes maior do que isso. O que deixa muito claro para a gente que existe uma lacuna financeira enorme para a gente pensar na proteção da biodiversidade, e é nesse contexto que as finanças para a biodiversidade são tão importantes, né? A questão é que, para cobrir uma lacuna desse tamanho, a única forma de você fazê-lo é misturando capitais de diferentes naturezas. A gente precisa misturar capitais privados, capitais públicos e capitais que também venham de fins filantrópicos. Eu diria que uma das questões mais importantes nessa mistura de capitais, em ter um capital híbrido para diferentes ferramentas, é a gente poder utilizar o que cada um desses capitais tem de característica melhor. Por exemplo, capitais filantrópicos tendem a ser muito flexíveis, mas, em geral, têm um volume mais reduzido. Capitais privados já têm um volume muito maior, mas, em geral, são muito mais limitados em questões da onde eles podem ser aplicados. E os capitais públicos, os recursos públicos, eles têm uma função muito importante na questão de estruturar esses mecanismos e essas ferramentas, né? Então, isso é muito importante, essa mistura desses capitais, e hoje a gente já tem cardápio bem grande em termos de diversidade de ações e de iniciativas que já estão em curso. A gente pode falar, por exemplo, de pagamento por serviços ambientais, mecanismos de isenções fiscais, compensação ambientais. A gente tem diversos fundos que existem pelo mundo inteiro, em termos de fundos para conservação de áreas protegidas, mercados verdes. Então, hoje a gente tem realmente um repertório bem grande de finanças, dessas finanças para a conservação da biodiversidade. O que é importante é que muitas dessas finanças, elas podem ser replicadas, mas elas têm que ser sempre adaptadas ao contexto nos quais elas se encontram, né? Mas eu queria colocar um ponto que eu acho que é muito importante, é que além da gente pensar em finanças para a conservação da biodiversidade em si, é muito importante que alguns desses mecanismos e essas finanças pensem também como que a gente cria, como que a gente estrutura uma economia mais inclusiva, na qual a gente tem a participação dos povos indígenas, a participação dos povos tradicionais, porque eles nada mais são do que agentes ativos na conservação dessa biodiversidade, né? Então, eu acho que esse é um ponto muito importante, acho que a gente vai discutir aqui iniciativas que são participatórias, né, que são participativas, então vai ser interessante, e nós vamos ter exemplos também do Brasil e da Costa Rica, e a gente sabe que hoje a América Latina é um dos focos de mais criações em termos de inovação e pioneirismo dessas ferramentas para a conservação da biodiversidade.
Obrigada, Marina. Ótimo te ouvir. Fez um apanhado bem geral, ótimo. Entonces, ahora, Marianela, algum de los puntos que Marina ha compartido, yo creo que tiene como mucha compatibilidad con la realidad del mecanismo de microfinanzas, ¿no? De Funcooperación. Entonces, si tú puedes como nos contar cómo es la estructura del mecanismo, los desafíos, oportunidades, tanto de creación como de manejo y gestión, pero también cómo es la interacción con los stakeholders. Gracias.
Muchas gracias y realmente estoy muy feliz de estar compartiendo y el hecho de que GLF haya puesto este tema con la relevancia que tiene el buscar mecanismos innovadores para promover esa transformación. Definitivamente los elementos que mencionaba Marina son muy pertinentes. Los mecanismos financieros tienen que ser adaptados al contexto y tal vez en ese sentido voy a comentar la experiencia de Funcooperación. Funcooperación es una ONG dedicada a las microfinanzas en Costa Rica. Somos además el ente nacional de implementación del Fondo de Adaptación, acreditado al Fondo de Adaptación. Y entonces nuestro enfoque ha sido buscar transformar o brindar mediante mecanismos de financiamiento oportunidades a poblaciones que tienen dificultad de acceso a la banca tradicional o accesos de financiamiento normal y tradicional, justamente para que puedan hacer las transformaciones a ser más sostenibles o a generar las mismas actividades productivas, pero con un impacto ambiental positivo o social o mayor impacto social positivo. Esto lo hemos hecho, tenemos productos de crédito específicos y por eso es que creo que Marina hizo un muy buen contexto inicial, porque al final para poder llegar y dar esa transformación hemos creado dos productos de crédito específicos, Agricultura Proclima y Ganadería Proclima, que buscan justamente brindar el financiamiento para aquellas actividades tradicionales o no que quieran transformarse implementando acciones climáticas, tanto de adaptación como de reducción de emisiones, pero también justamente en hacer un trabajo mucho más con agrobiodiversidad. De hecho, tenemos un producto específico de mujeres mujeres pro natura. ¿Cómo funciona? Lo que funciona es un mecanismo que incorpora no solo las condiciones a la medida al productor, a los ciclos productivos, a las condiciones. Hemos trabajado muy fuerte con proveedores de tecnología, por ejemplo, si el enfoque es conservación de suelos y riego por goteo. Muchas veces lo que sucede es que los proveedores son a grandes empresas y no hay proveedores adaptados con costos adecuados a pequeños. Entonces hemos venido trabajando con que los proveedores vean que le pueden brindar esas soluciones tecnológicas a un costo accesible. Y el otro tema es esa combinación de crédito, lo hemos combinado con ese apoyo con los proyectos de cooperación, específicamente con el financiamiento del Fondo de Adaptación, que es el que nos ayuda a saber cómo hacer estas transformaciones, cuáles son esos casos exitosos, esas medidas que realmente funcionan al contexto, y de alguna forma es el cómo y el por qué. Entonces yo veo a doña Sonia que hizo esas transformaciones, implementó esas medidas y ahora tiene mejor productividad, tiene mejores condiciones. Cuando llueve mucho no se le lava el suelo, y tiene una serie de resultados. Y entonces yo, vecina de doña Sonia, digo, voy a hacer lo mismo. Y entonces es un poco por eso es que esos proyectos ayudan a tener el qué hacer, pero también el cómo hacer y el por qué hacerlo, en el sentido de que nos ayuden a hacer el escalamiento. Para poder escalar hay que combinar esos mecanismos de crédito con algunos mecanismos apropiados, y nosotros en el caso nuestro lo hemos hecho con seguros agropecuarios. Trabajamos con el Instituto Nacional de Seguros para que los seguros agropecuarios incluyan consideraciones de adaptación al cambio climático que al fin y al cabo reducen el riesgo. Entonces, si un productor o productora ha hecho medidas de adaptación al cambio climático, baja su riesgo y el seguro le sale más barato. Al tener seguro, también tiene más acceso a crédito. Y el otro tema es, hay un mecanismo local de avales, porque la población en vulnerabilidad social, socioeconómica, tiene más dificultad de acceso normalmente también por garantías. Y en ese caso hay un mecanismo de avales que le permite a población en condición de pobreza tener acceso a avales para poder financiarse mediante crédito. De esta forma, entonces, logramos escalar, convertir esos casos exitosos, escalándolo a muchos más con el financiamiento, con la herramienta de financiamiento donde muchos más pueden accesar. Nuestro enfoque ha sido facilitar esas condiciones, esa asistencia técnica, y tal vez para cerrar, quiero comentar que uno de los temas más importantes para nosotros ha sido la gran sinergia que hemos trabajado con muchísimas organizaciones, porque tal vez la pregunta es, ¿y qué tan grandes son ustedes? Y bueno, somos una organización pequeña en el contexto en Costa Rica, somos 28 personas, pero tenemos cartera en todo el país. Yo sé que Costa Rica es mucho más pequeño que Brasil y que el resto del mundo, pero justamente el trabajo en sinergia y ese respeto o esa inspiración en el ODS 17, de que al final tenemos que trabajar contribuyendo y generando sinergias para generar más resultados, definitivamente está en nuestro ADN. Entonces, ha sido la forma en que nosotros hemos llegado más allá. Porque esos mecanismos al final complementan, no porque todos los tengamos nosotros, sino porque hemos buscado las piezas y hemos invitado a otros que tienen las piezas a sumar. Y yo creo que eso es una de las claves probablemente para seguir generando mucho mayor impacto en esa transformación a la sostenibilidad.
Gracias, Marianela. Solo por curiosidad, ¿cuánto tiempo llevó para diseñar, para crear el mecanismo?
Sí, bueno, nosotros como organización de cooperación tiene 25 años, y de hecho se inspiró su nacimiento en el Acuerdo de Río. Nacimos en el 94, 2 años posterior a la Cumbre de Río. Sin embargo, el crédito se creó ya hace unos 14 años. Sin embargo, más recientemente, o el mecanismo de microfinanzas, pero más recientemente, en los últimos 5 años, es que ya hemos ido implementando, con el apoyo del Fondo de Adaptación y con el apoyo justamente de esa implementación de acciones climáticas, ya los mecanismos específicos que son agricultura pro clima y ganadería pro clima y mujeres naturales.
Entonces, no es un hecho sencillo, requiere mucha como ganas de hacer las cosas juntos, ¿no? Yo pienso.
Es que justamente cuando lo tenés que hacer a la medida, no es como seguir una receta e implementarla y ya, muy bien, sino que tenés que ir justamente madurándolo y entendiendo de que las cosas, no hay un one size fits all, ¿verdad? Es que tenés que ir madurándolo y mejorándolo, y entonces ir entendiendo que inclusive diferentes comunidades y diferentes poblaciones pueden tener diferentes necesidades. Entonces, eso es lo que más quizás nos ha llevado tiempo de maduración, pues tenemos ya años de estar trabajando en microfinanzas, pero definitivamente todos los días buscamos y nos damos cuenta de, ok, no estamos haciendo, o sea, siempre la pregunta es cómo escalar. O sea, el reto a nivel mundial, creo, y para todos, es cómo multiplicamos exponencialmente lo que se está haciendo, las cosas bien que se están haciendo, cómo las escalamos multiplicadas exponencialmente. Y eso al final es justamente el pensamiento que estamos, bueno, ¿cómo convertimos estos bonitos casos exitosos en que todo el sector sea así? o en que o la comunidad sea así, o que mucho más, o sea, cómo hacer ese tipping point para hacer que al hecho de que muchos se han transformado, ya después va a ser más fácil que los otros se transformen. Entonces, es un pensamiento de innovación continua en la que tenés que estar para justamente lograr esa transformación.
Sí, aunque todos los puntos que tú has mencionado ahora sean interesantes, para mí el punto culminante sin duda es la cooperación, ¿no? Porque sin alianza entre los actores creo que ustedes no hubieran logrado tantos éxitos, ¿no?
Definitivamente.
Então, eu gostaria de perguntar para a Marina. Marina, como é que você vê a aplicação desses instrumentos financeiros, né, que contam com essa mescla de fontes, que nem a Marianela falou, mas especificamente aplicado para a realidade da Amazônia brasileira? Então, obrigada.
É muito interessante, porque o relato que eu vou fazer agora tem muitas similaridades com o que a Marianela falou na Costa Rica, mas como a gente estava dizendo mesmo, com esse ingrediente especial, que é como que você adapta aquilo para a realidade, né? Eu atualmente trabalho para a Conexus, que é um Instituto de Conexões Sustentáveis, que tem como missão ativar o que a gente chama desse ecossistema de negócios comunitários que ajudam tanto na conservação da floresta, quanto na criação de uma economia mais inclusiva, né? E esse não é um tema novo, isso já é uma questão que a gente vem trabalhando há décadas. E os principais gargalos desse problema são 3, eu diria, né? Um é que muitos desses negócios comunitários, eles têm modelos de negócios ainda pequenos que precisam ser melhorados em termos de capacidade organizacional, capacidade de educação financeira, vários tipos de assessoria. Por um outro lado, a gente tem que esses negócios comunitários, eles têm muita dificuldade de acesso ao mercado, muitas vezes estão em regiões mais isoladas e vendem para uma série de intermediários antes de conseguirem acessar o comprador final. E o terceiro é que não existe, como a Marianela estava falando muito bem, um portfólio de veículos financeiros apropriado para esse público em particular, né? Então, o que a Conexus resolveu fazer é, na verdade, trabalhar com essas 3 estratégias de forma sinérgica, né? Então, a gente não trabalha com uma ou com outra, a gente trabalha com as 3, e como disse a Marianela muito bem, a gente não é capaz de fazer isso sozinho. Então, o papel da Conexus é exatamente de ser uma organização intermediária que apoia e que faz várias execuções que acontecem a nível do campo, onde já tem várias organizações fazendo um trabalho muito bom, e a ideia da gente é exatamente fazer essa conexão, essa ponte. Eu vou dar um exemplo, por exemplo, a gente tem nessa questão das finanças adequadas, a gente criou o Fundo Conexus, né? Esse Fundo Conexus, ele conta hoje com capital híbrido, tanto capital reembolsável quanto capital não reembolsável, né? E a gente acaba dando para esses negócios comunitários alguns tipos de mecanismos, de serviços como recuperação de crédito, que às vezes ela é necessária. Outro deles também a gente faz um aval ou garantia para pagamento de outros empréstimos que possam ser feitos, e a gente faz também empréstimos ágeis e rápidos, exatamente para poder cobrir alguma lacuna importante que eles tenham, seja de capital de giro, seja de fomento para a produção, que são muito importantes, né? E dentro do fundo que a gente foi criando, a gente também conseguiu, paralelamente, mapear que hoje, no Brasil como um todo, existem mais de 1.000 negócios comunitários. A gente acha que esse número ele é muito subestimado, a gente imagina que talvez seja até dezenas de vezes maior do que isso. Mas o que a gente viu nesse primeiro levantamento desses 1.000 negócios comunitários, e 400 delas estão na Amazônia, é que eles têm como se fala, um lucro de mais ou menos 600 mil reais por ano, o que é um lucro muito pequeno, ou seja, o potencial que esses negócios têm de alavancar e de se beneficiar mais são muito maiores. Então, como é que a gente cria um contexto, cria essas condições para que esses negócios possam florescer, como a gente fala, né? E no Brasil, diferente da Costa Rica, aí que está a história do tempero, de como é que você combina para o seu contexto, a gente tem uma política pública muito bem estruturada desde 1996, chamada PRONAF, que é o Programa Nacional de Agricultura Familiar. O PRONAF ele dedica mais ou menos 33 bilhões de reais por ano para esses pequenos produtores e populações extrativistas. Só que o problema que a gente vê hoje é que, por exemplo, nesse estimativa que a gente fez com as 1.000 comunidades, apenas 10% delas conseguem acessar esse crédito. E um outro número espantoso é que apenas 2,5% desse crédito é usado para atividades produtivas. Ou seja, esse crédito acaba financiando gado, produção de milho e outros tipos de produção que são exatamente adversas à conservação ambiental. Então, a estratégia que a gente montou, com todos esses mecanismos que eu mencionei para vocês, era como é que a gente podia criar essa assessoria financeira para essas organizações e ajudá-los a fazer essa transição em sair desse empréstimo que eles recebem da Conexus, que tem um juro, ele tem um juro pequeno, ele tem um juro de 0,5% ao ano, mas ele tem um juro, para ir para uma linha de crédito do governo subsidiada que tem de 2,75% a 4% ao ano, que é muito melhor. Então, a gente prepara como um mecanismo ponte, né, nesse meio tempo, e aí eles fazem essa transição para acessarem a linha do Pronaf nesse meio tempo que a gente está com a gente. Então, a gente faz todo o processo de assessoria para que depois eles possam ser autossuficientes e terem acesso à linha de crédito, que é muito melhor para eles do que hoje, né? O que a gente tem visto, na verdade, nos 2 primeiros anos, a gente fez 17 protótipos, que a gente chama, a gente emprestou para experimentar esse mecanismo e ver como é que ele funcionava. A gente teve uma taxa de sucesso muito grande, porque para cada real que a Conexus colocou, a gente conseguiu alavancar R$5 em termos de créditos subsidiados pelo governo, né? Então, foi um sucesso bastante. Mas aí o grande segredo era, como disse a Marianela muito bem, como é que a gente escalona isso? Como é que a gente traz isso para, em vez de a gente ajudar 5 comunidades, a gente ajudar 50, a gente ajudar 500. E o que a gente está estruturando agora, juntamente com o Banco da Amazônia, que é um banco público brasileiro, é criando a figura do que a gente chama de ativadores de crédito, que vão ser pessoas que são da comunidade, das comunidades, que vão ser capacitadas por nós e por outros vários atores, e essas pessoas vão servir como intermediários nessa negociação entre as cooperativas e associações e o banco, o BASA, né, para os empréstimos. E essas pessoas elas vão ser inicialmente pagas pela Conexus, mas com o tempo o processo de pagamento, de remuneração dessas pessoas vão ser com base não só ao crédito que elas vão estar concedendo, mas principalmente a adimplência desse crédito. Então, essa pessoa vai ter um interesse muito grande de fazer com que não só ela dê crédito, mas que o crédito seja bem pago para ela poder ter uma remuneração melhor no final. Então, esse mecanismo a gente está testando, né? A gente está agora, a gente deve chegar até junho do ano que vem com 60 ativadores de crédito na Amazônia, e é como a gente espera poder escalonar esse mecanismo, né? O fundo, durante a pandemia, era quando a gente ia começar toda essa estruturação de treinar os ativadores de crédito, a gente teve que dar um passo para trás, como todo mundo teve, né? E acabamos também criando uma linha de crédito especial do Covid. Então, a gente conseguiu, em 3 meses, captar mais de 8 milhões de reais, que a gente está criando como uma linha de socorro, a gente fala que é uma linha emergencial para esses negócios comunitários, porque o nosso receio é que, durante a pandemia, era exatamente esses negócios comunitários que iam ser os mais atingidos. Então, como é que a gente tinha uma possibilidade de dar uma linha de crédito que possibilitasse que eles conseguissem sobreviver durante esse momento de crise, né? Para a Amazônia, a gente já alocou cerca de 2 milhões de reais, a gente tem esse mecanismo todo para o Brasil, mas a gente está fazendo isso. E agora a ideia é crescer esses mecanismos. A gente tem um projeto, o Fundo Conexus foi contemplado e foi premiado como um dos instrumentos de finanças verdes mais inovadores e promissores no ano passado pelo Climate Policy Initiative. E a gente passou por um processo de mentoria de cerca de 6 meses para eles ajudarem a gente a pensar qual que é o modelo de negócios do fundo, e a nossa ideia é, nos próximos 5 anos, a gente chegar num fundo de 60 milhões de reais, dos quais 50 milhões de reais são reembolsáveis e 10 milhões de reais não são reembolsáveis. E a gente já está lá, a gente já tem 10 milhões.
Que ótimo saber disso. Muito bom. Então, eu vou aproveitar. Marina, bom, assim, a sensação que me traz é que todos esses mecanismos que a Conexus tem criado tem um envolvimento muito grande das comunidades, né, locais, mas isso normalmente não é a prática mais comum, infelizmente. Então, eu vou pedir para o Elcio, né, minha pergunta para ele é para ele contar um pouco como que você vê, Elcio, Toia, o que a gente poderia fazer para incluir mais essas comunidades dentro dessas soluções que nem a Marina falou, né? Usualmente, esses instrumentos de financiamento tendem a não incluir tanto as comunidades locais, o que não acontece, por exemplo, no caso que a Marina acabou de compartilhar, né? Porque essa organização da qual ela faz parte é uma organização que tenta justamente endereçar esse gap, essa lacuna de instituições que ajudam a conectar a comunidade local com oportunidades inovadoras de financiamento. Então, na sua visão, como que está hoje o cenário atual da participação, participação ativa, do engajamento ativo das comunidades indígenas dentro dessas soluções financeiras, e o que você acha que pode ser feito para melhorar, para suprir esses desafios de participação?
Boa tarde, Ana.
Boa tarde.
Marianela e Marina, né? O que tanto a Marianela traz e que a Marina também traz é muito interessante, né? Se tratando, por exemplo, de financiamento, né, de produtos da sociobiodiversidade. Em relação aos povos indígenas, perguntando assim direto, e eu sendo muito direto, dizendo que podemos ajudar, vamos demarcar os territórios indígenas. Porque com a demarcação dos territórios indígenas, né, da titulação dos territórios, é que nós vamos poder, por exemplo, trabalhar a questão da economia, né? E nós iniciamos aqui no Brasil um processo, né, levando o Estado para conhecer melhor os territórios indígenas, né? Como a Marina sabe, a Amazônia, a Marianela também sabe, é muito parecido. A Amazônia ela é grande e difícil, né? Você também conhece, de difícil acesso, né? E para que as políticas públicas cheguem nos municípios, né, que é bem mais próximo das grandes cidades, né, da capital, né, se torna quase impossível tu implementar vários projetos, né, da cidade, né? Aí tu pega uma comunidade indígena como a minha, né, que são 12 horas de carro, depois tu tem que andar mais um dia de barco, né? Então, realmente, a distância, ela traz muitos prejuízos para que uma comunidade ela possa pegar seu produto e colocar no mercado, né? Mas como eu estava falando, né? Nós fizemos o inverso, né? Nós trabalhamos muito a questão das políticas públicas, né? Para que o governo pudesse financiar, né, a parte, né, dos investimentos nos territórios indígenas. E aí nós criamos, conjuntamente com o Ministério do Meio Ambiente, a Política Nacional de Gestão Ambiental em Terras Indígenas, né? Que ela visa desde a questão, por exemplo, da recuperação, mas também trabalhar um pouco sobre os serviços ambientais, né? E respeitando a questão, por exemplo, dos conhecimentos tradicionais, né, dos povos indígenas e a questão da gestão dos territórios, né? Mas não é fácil tu conseguir recurso, né, do Estado para essas ações, né? Principalmente porque para nós povos indígenas aqui na Amazônia brasileira se torna difícil, porque nós vamos dizer assim, nós só temos o usufruto das terras indígenas, né? Nós não temos uma propriedade, né? Então não tem como tu garantir, né, que se tu tem um financiamento, tu buscar esse financiamento e ter garantia, né, para o banco dizer, não, agora eu vou emprestar 50 mil para aquela comunidade para ela trabalhar a questão, colocar no mercado a sua castanha, né? Então, esse é um dos gargalos bastante complicado para a gente, né? E acho que essa experiência, por exemplo, que a Conex traz, ela é bastante inovadora, né? Porque são os pequenos projetos, às vezes demonstrativos, que têm alavancado outras, aliás, grandes doadores, né, para auxiliar as populações que vivem na floresta, né? Então, acho que, penso eu, que nós temos que trabalhar, né, no caso dos povos indígenas, primeiro a questão que o Estado brasileiro crie em seu plano orçamentário mecanismo aliás, recurso, destina recurso para que se possa trabalhar esse primeiro momento, né? Que é tu trabalhar todas as cadeias, né, da sociobiodiversidade para que as populações indígenas possam vir usufruir, né, desse trabalho, mas também colocar seu produto no mercado, né? Nós temos alguns exemplos aqui que são interessantes, são de mulheres, né? Um que acontece no Rio Negro, né, que é a pimenta, né, que são as mulheres que estão implementando. Outro também que acontece bastante interessante é em Roraima, que também é a questão da pimenta. Houve vários investimentos e as mulheres resolveram trabalhar a pimenta, né? O que falta, né, para essas mulheres é um pouco a questão da assistência técnica, né, que realmente, né, é a comunidade com seu conhecimento tradicional, mas é necessário que essas iniciativas também tenham novas tecnologias para tu, né, melhorar a sua produção, melhorar a qualidade da imagem do seu produto para tu ter mais acesso a mercados externos, né? Eu acho que isso também pode ser casado com essas ideias que a gente pode estar contribuindo para que as populações indígenas, né, venham acessar, né, esse recurso e trabalhar com a questão da sociobiodiversidade. Né? Por exemplo, o cordão que eu estou utilizando, né? Então, se nós fizéssemos ele com outras peças, né, prata, ouro, eles ficariam chique também, como está o meu, né? Mas, né, tu já agregaria mais valor, né? Então, tem várias situações, né? E uma outra situação que também é interessante é uma comunidade na Quechua que trabalha com cacau nativo, né? Então, eles já tem uns equipamentos já funcionando, já vende na região, mas precisa de um incentivo, né, de recursos maiores para que eles possam fazer a exportação e pegar novos mercados. Claro, também tu tem que fazer o estudo do mercado, né? Nós vamos pensar, nós vamos atingir o mercado. Primeiro, também tem que fazer isso, né? É isso um pouco, essa primeira minha contribuição.
Obrigada, Elcio, foi ótimo. Deu um panorama bem rápido e sucinto de como está a situação das comunidades indígenas na Amazônia brasileira. E dentro dessa questão, né, das políticas públicas financiarem parte da atuação das comunidades indígenas, entra o grande valor de organizações que nem o Conexus, que nem o mecanismo de microfinanças que a Mariela falou, porque a gente consegue colocar vocês mais em contato direto com outras fontes de financiamento, de forma que vocês não fiquem tão dependentes, né, do governo e possam também, como você falou, inovar, né, agregar valor de forma que exponha mais, de uma maneira positiva, as comunidades. Marianela, yo quiero mucho oír la experiencia de cooperación con las comunidades, pero aunque no nos queda mucho tiempo, entonces yo gustaría de enfocar en algunas preguntas de la audiencia, ¿está bien? Então, Toya, eu agora vou compartilhar algumas perguntas da audiência, do público com a gente, para que a gente possa ter essa troca com eles, tá bom? Então, a primeira, e se sintam à vontade, as perguntas não são direcionadas a ninguém, então se sintam à vontade para trocar e para a gente fazer um diálogo entre os três, tá bom? Marianela, ¿está bien? Como creo que para contestar todos juntos. Entonces, la primera pregunta, yo pienso que es muy importante por el momento que estamos viviendo. ¿Cuáles son algunos cambios por COVID que han afectado el financiamiento de una bioeconomia en la América Latina? Entonces, eu acho que, Marina, você pode começar tocando, porque você falou um pouquinho do fundo para o Covid, como é que foi captar esse recurso, se é fácil, se não é, e, enfim, a abertura dos doadores para isso.
Eu diria que foi incrível a resposta e a flexibilidade que os doadores, em geral, mostraram num momento difícil como esse, né? E a predisposição deles em tentar exatamente buscar soluções que pudessem mitigar alguns dos impactos negativos que a pandemia veio trazer, né? Então, nesse sentido, a gente conseguiu, em poucos meses, como eu estava falando, conseguir os recursos para criar essa linha emergencial, que talvez num momento sem Covid a gente não teria conseguido alavancar recursos tão rapidamente, né, da forma que ela ocorreu. E isso por quê? Porque a pandemia, o que ela trouxe como consequência é que os principais mercados para onde esses negócios comunitários vendem seus produtos foram paralisados, que foram as escolas, os hospitais, vários restaurantes acabaram cancelando pedidos que tinham, se essas cooperativas já tinham feito. Então, era um momento mesmo muito emergencial, e eu acho que toda a comunidade, sejam os doadores brasileiros, quanto até mesmo os doadores internacionais, perceberam que era um momento de flexibilizar e pensar junto como que a gente pode atuar de forma a mitigar isso. E acho que a gente teve também uma aceleração muito grande no uso de ferramentas digitais desses negócios comunitários. Então, uma coisa que muitos poucos faziam, começaram, de repente, a improvisar, usar o WhatsApp para fazer pedido, criar uma plataforma rápida online. Então, assim, o que você viu é que existiu um campo de inovação que acabou puxando essas organizações para fazerem uma transição digital que antes talvez ocorresse muito mais lentamente, né? Então, só esses dois pontos que eu gostaria de colocar.
Toia, como é que está sendo para vocês? Você consegue ver essa mesma receptividade? Os recursos acabaram, os recursos chegaram para vocês? Como é que está sendo com o Covid?
Com o Covid, várias situações entre as organizações indígenas ficou complicado, né? E aí nós tivemos que nos adaptar, como a Marina falou, né? Nós tivemos que buscar os nossos parceiros, né, financiadores, e dizer, nós temos tantos mil, mas agora não dá para fazer o trabalho, então vamos investir isso no auxílio às comunidades indígenas, né? E aí isso foi muito, muito, muito importante, né? Essa aproximação maior, né? Via online, né? Porque realmente, Maria, talvez fosse numa outra situação, talvez não teríamos muita ajuda, né? Houve várias lives, né, do movimento indígena, e que conseguimos financiadores, né, pessoais de $500, de $100, de $1.000, né? E conseguimos também financiamento do governo francês, né, para contribuir com a bacia amazônica, né? E com isso nós conseguimos dar uma ajuda ao nosso povo, né, nos 9 países da bacia amazônica, né? Então, conseguimos, sim, nessa época da pandemia, a gente viu muitas pessoas solidárias, sabe? Muito mesmo, né? Empresas, né? Pessoas do dia a dia, né? Financiando ou colocando a sua credibilidade, por exemplo, para chamar os artistas, né? Para as lives, né? Então, acho que foi mútua ajuda, né? Quem podia dar o recurso. Quem não podia fazer a mobilização, fazia a mobilização. Então, aqueles que não conseguiu fazer a mobilização, mas tinha credibilidade de chamar o artista, chamava o artista, né? Então, acho que foi muito, muito importante essa solidariedade, não só do Brasil, né, mas do mundo inteiro com relação aos povos indígenas, porque nós ficamos numa situação, gente, de que foram feitas as ações, foram desenvolvidas ações pelo Estado, mas pensando nas cidades, não pensando nas populações que na floresta vivem, né? Então, nós tivemos que nos adaptar rapidinho e usar a ferramenta online como uma ferramenta para que a gente pudesse estar demonstrando o que está acontecendo com a gente, mas também buscando essa solidariedade. É isso.
Obrigada, Toya. Y entonces, Marianela, ¿cómo fue? ¿Ustedes tuvieron una estrategia específica para el COVID o no?
Estoy totalmente de acuerdo con lo que ha mencionado. si bien no teníamos una estrategia antes del COVID, no nos hubiéramos jamás esperado el nivel de transformación tan impresionante que ha tenido en todas nuestras vidas. Y yo creo que eso es igual en todo el mundo. Creo que ha sido muy, muy interesante, y ya lo mencionaron Ercio y Marina, la transformación que ha implicado de la forma de hacer negocios de todos. Y pongo algunos ejemplos. En el mecanismo de crédito es muy importante el mecanismo de asistencia técnica, acompañamiento, capacitaciones, actividades de información, de divulgación. Y todas esas se hacían, por ejemplo, días de campo. Entonces hacíamos un productor o productora que tenía un caso exitoso, hacíamos un día de campo ahí para que ella compartiera qué es lo que había hecho, vinieran otros productores o productoras, vieran qué es lo que estaba haciendo y digamos, quisieran replicarlo. Dije, eso no se podía hacer con el COVID, y entonces estamos haciendo desde los últimos 7 meses días de campo virtual. Entonces, hacemos visita a la finca por medio de Facebook Live. Obviamente en muchas de las fincas no hay acceso a internet y todo, entonces sí hacemos el esfuerzo de ir de previo, hacerle, aunque sea con el teléfono, ni siquiera nada caro, y hacer entonces la entrevista, enséñenos qué hizo aquí, qué hizo allá, y entonces hemos tenido una gran cantidad de actividades de divulgación, de información, de capacitación. Y solo para hacer un ejemplo, el año pasado en las actividades que tuvimos de ese tipo durante el año, tuvimos unas 1.500 personas que participaron. Este año, en 2 meses, ya teníamos 1.500 personas que estaban participando. Entonces, eso inmediatamente nos dijo, estamos llegándole a muchísima más gente. Obviamente, probablemente hay muchos otros factores que se complementan, pero me parece que entonces en el tema de esa transformación de que podemos inclusive tener más acceso a más personas, a divulgar la información, y obviamente el hecho de que todos nos obligamos a como fuera aprender estas herramientas, y en muchos casos estamos hablando de WhatsApp, Facebook, que probablemente ya las usaban. Y también otra de las cosas que hemos hecho ya en el manejo del crédito es que, por ejemplo, las visitas de análisis, nosotros hacemos visita al productor y todo, las estamos haciendo por WhatsApp en video. O las formalizaciones, que es un proceso formal donde hay que ver y explicar y todo, las hacemos en Zoom, y entonces hemos hecho algunos cursitos sencillos en línea también, o videitos explicándole cómo hacer, cómo bajar Zoom en su teléfono, cómo hacer, porque pues nuestra cartera de clientes sí en 90% tiene, bueno, no solo la nuestra, sino en general en la población en Costa Rica, pues sí hay un acceso muy profundo a teléfono, no a computadora, pero sí a teléfono. Entonces inmediatamente tenés WhatsApp, bajas Zoom, o cualquiera de esas herramientitas, y de una vez tenés, obviamente hay que aprenderlo, pero es un proceso, y ya tenés las sesiones de capacitación, las sesiones de formalización, de análisis, de seguimiento, y cómo le ha ido, y mándeme una foto por WhatsApp, cómo fue, y realmente eso también, y una cosa que también mencionó Elcio y mencionaron Marina, es que también las formas de comercialización, que quizás fue uno de los temas que más fue afectado, se rompió la cadena de comercialización con el tema del COVID, pues hay muchos que han dicho, bueno, no tengo la capacidad de yo llevarlo, pero me uno con los de la comunidad, o me uno con el resto de la cadena para entonces distribuir juntos, y ya entonces también ha habido una grandísima colaboración justamente en romper esas barreras en la comercialización y en usar canales alternativos, WhatsApp y Facebook y otras cosas. Y creo que si bien hay muchísimas cosas negativas, obviamente, que nos ha traído el COVID a nivel global, la reacción en muchas personas que han sido, me tengo que reinventar, ha sido sumamente positivo en el sentido de generar mayor sinergia, mayor acceso y uso de la tecnología, y que eso les sirva, que sea en pro de ese montón de pequeñitas empresas y productores en todo el país. Creo que eso es súper importante. Y una cosa que quiero resaltar aquí, y que quizás está relacionado con otra de las preguntas, es el gran poder que tiene el aprendizaje horizontal y la cooperación sur-sur entre de productor a productor. Y yo pienso que y relacionado también con el acceso a tecnología, eso también está dando la posibilidad a que antes, para ir a otra finca, tengo que pensar el traslado, el tiempo, el costo. Ahora es mucho más sencillo si realmente trabajamos en facilitar las medidas para que los casos exitosos y las fincas puedan compartir también vía virtual sus ejemplos y que otros tengan acceso a eso. Me parece que es es una gran oportunidad para seguir. Bueno, hoy estamos desde diferentes partes del mundo compartiendo estas experiencias sin haber gastado un 5 en tiquetes ni en otras cosas. Creo que hay que aprovechar y hay muchas cosas en las que no podemos volver atrás en muchos de estos aprendizajes que nos ha obligado el COVID.
Gracias, Marianela. Entonces, voy a leer más una pregunta y me gustaría que cada uno de ustedes comparten un mensaje principal con base en hechos claves o lecciones aprendidas de sus experiências, não? Então, Elcio, se você puder, por favor, passar uma mensagem principal sobre as comunidades indígenas e locais dentro desse mecanismo para financiamento. A pergunta é como alinear a necessidade de transicionar a uma bioeconomia com a necessidade de criar capital humano em la região. Entonces, como trae la distinción que muchas veces hacemos entre economía en este lado, capital humano en ese. Creo que desmistificamos eso con esta plenaria, pero un mensaje de bye bye para el público. ¿Quién quiere empezar?
Primeiro agradecer o convite novamente, né, que foi um painel mais tranquilo que eu participei em toda a minha vida. Eu tenho 52 anos e esse foi o mais light, mas com muita informação, de maneira simples, né, e que bem objetiva para o público que a gente quer atingir, né. Eu acho que isso que é o fundamental desse espaço que eu estou participando hoje. Mas com relação aos povos indígenas, nós estamos aí com vários conhecimentos, né, tanto das plantas medicinais como de outros, como a utilização do solo, como manejar, né, a floresta, né? Agora precisamos, né, que outros possam vir somar junto com a gente para a gente utilizar esses conhecimentos e esses recursos do nosso planeta de forma organizada e que possamos garantir toda essa riqueza que temos hoje, principalmente na Amazônia brasileira e na bacia amazônica, para os futuros brasileiros, futuros indígenas da bacia amazônica e futuro pessoas do planeta, né? É isso. É a união que faz a força. Obrigado.
Obrigada, Toia.
Eu queria aproveitar a fala do Elcio e dizer também que foi um prazer estar nesse painel, eu conheço já bastante o trabalho da COIAB, né, e já sabia disso, mas a Marianela, a gente tem muito que conversar sobre o que vocês estão fazendo na Costa Rica, o que a gente está fazendo no Brasil, certamente, e eu diria que, assim, talvez para finalizar, dizer que essas ferramentas para a conservação da biodiversidade, se a gente fosse pensar, elas não vão ser todas iguais, mas elas têm, da mesma forma que quase todo bolo a gente precisa de farinha, ovo e manteiga, eu diria que a gente tem 3 ingredientes principais que a gente precisa: capital híbrido, cooperação, né, trabalho em rede e pensar de forma sistêmica, né? Então, eu diria para vocês que isso eu diria que são os ingredientes principais que todo mundo tem que pensar quando está pensando numa ferramenta para a conservação da biodiversidade. As outras coisas, os sabores, as outras coisas que vêm depois, vai depender do tipo de bolo que você quiser fazer.
Muito bom. Adorei a analogia. Marianela?
Absolutamente de acuerdo con Elcio y Marina. Ha sido un panel muy, muy interesante y además absolutamente coincidente en cuál es la ruta, y me encanta aprender de lo que están haciendo también en Brasil, que es definitivamente también un poquito de luz al centro de América. Quizás quiero también además estar totalmente de acuerdo con Marina, la relevancia de que el financiamiento tiene que ser un financiamiento a la medida y que ese financiamiento implica no solamente créditos, sino también mecanismos financieros que apoyen y generen y faciliten acceso, y yo creo que la palabra clave es acceso, y para ese acceso definitivamente es necesario esa creación de capacidad y ese fortalecimiento de capacidades en las comunidades, pero en general también de los mecanismos financieros en esas comunidades. A veces pensamos que al que hay que fortalecer es a la finca o al productor, pero a veces lo que tenemos es que transformar a los financieros que entiendan cuál es en realidad los resultados que se tienen a nivel de campo y que cuáles son esas medidas que pueden generar mayor valor, solo que no son tradicionales. Entonces, que implica esa forma de buscar y transformar. Y el otro tema que quiero mencionar, con lo que también estoy totalmente, y lo mencionaron también Elcio y Marina, es la gran relevancia de trabajar en sinergia, de trabajar y sumar. Yo creo que el mundo, si acaso queremos transformarlo, necesitamos un mundo que genere, que sume, ni que reste ni que duplique, que sume. Tenemos que sumar, no puede haber otra forma de estar viendo solamente en todo momento cómo más sumamos. Obviamente escalamos, pero es que no vamos a escalar si no sumamos entre organizaciones, si no sumamos entre iniciativas, si no sumamos entre países, en factores. Desafortunadamente yo sé que algunos de nuestros liderazgos en todo el mundo no suman o no ayudan a sumar, pero es que yo creo que el poder de nosotros, los que estamos trabajando en muchas de estas acciones, son las que tenemos que salirnos de ese discurso de esos líderes a realmente busquemos cómo sumamos entre nosotros.
Muito obrigada, Marianela. Bom, gente, a gente está chegando no final da nossa sessão, da nossa plenária. Eu só queria passar a mensagem, diante de tudo, né, que vocês três falaram. Eu espero que a gente consiga aumentar as fontes de financiamento que fazem essa, digamos, essa conexão, essa cooperação entre as partes, porque a gente sabe que, usualmente, quando a gente vai usar essas fontes de recurso para cobrir custos operacionais, administrativos, às vezes é muito complicado. Então, talvez o Covid, né, tenha aberto os corações dos doadores, né, diante dessa necessidade de maior flexibilidade. E dentro dessa caixa, eu imagino que a gente tem a oportunidade de inovar e de fortalecer mais essas cooperações que vocês mencionaram, né? Então, cooperações sul-sul, norte-sul, país tropical com país não tropical, comunidade indígena, comunidade não indígena, de forma que a gente possa, então, aumentar, né, o que você falou, Marianela, a capacidade das instituições de uma maneira geral, porque esse intercâmbio de conhecimento é o que faz a gente, no final das contas, conseguir alavancar não só conhecimento aplicado, né, para a conservação da biodiversidade, mas a replicação de casos de sucesso, que nem vocês têm mostrado. Então, muito obrigada, muitas gracias por la atención y es eso, nos vemos en una otra oportunidad.
Gracias.
Buenas noches.
Un gran placer. Muchas gracias.
Prazer, tchau, tchau.
Tchau, tchau.